I wanted to talk about what's driving the spike, how much of it is global, how much of it's state specific, and when drivers might finally see some relief. But Patrick, first, this is clearly more than a spring run up or a spring increase in prices. I was wondering how much of the spike is being driven by the conflict and the threat to oil moving through the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces to this puzzle here, unpacking them all. We'll get into it. First of all, I think the recent rise here that many have seen in the last few weeks, average gas prices across the country up nearly 65 cents in the last month, compared to where we were prior to the U.S. attacking Iran. Well, gas prices up over $1 a gallon. As you mentioned, Washington State now above $5 a gallon, and even higher for diesel, which have set new all-time record highs. A lot of this being exacerbated by the Strait of Hormuz essentially being shut off to the flow of oil. Generally, 20 million barrels of oil would flow through the strait on a daily basis, and that's been blocked now for just about 5 weeks. And that's starting to really have a ripple effect into the global economy, especially areas like Asia that process a lot of that crude oil from countries like Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia are now running low on oil. So that's been a big part of pushing oil prices up. Washington is particularly susceptible, as are many coastal areas, the entire West Coast, the Gulf Coast, the East Coast of the US, simply because these are areas where refined products and oil can be more easily exported. Unlike the middle of the nation, if you think about North Dakota, there's really no way to ship that oil to a global market. Whereas many of the coastal regions, especially Western Washington, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel can easily be exported to countries overseas that are being heavily impacted by the Strait of Hormuz closure. And so that means that all these coastal areas are competing at a higher level, pushing prices up more dramatically. In addition, the West Coast suffering from another refinery shutdown in California, the second refinery to shut down permanently in the last 6 months. And that's tightened gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel supply in virtually the entire West Coast. 20% of California's gasoline refining capacity now offline. So, a lot to unpack here. A lot of California's refinery shutdowns have really been attributed to a continued closure between the guardrails, state regulators essentially starting to dictate more and more how refineries can operate their business in California, refineries opting to leave. That brings me to Washington State, the Cap and Invest program implemented a few years ago that essentially puts a huge tax on refiners to be able to produce the fuels that are needed in the marketplace. Refineries simply pass those costs along to the end consumer, whether it be airlines, trucking companies, or consumers. They're now bearing the cost of that Cap and Invest program. So a lot pushing prices up, a lot of it really influenced by the Strait of Hormuz. Prices higher on average in Washington State, again, because you're beholden to the global marketplace as well as the Cap and Invest program and all of the challenges in California.
And we're seeing high prices across the country. I think the national average is right around, we're a little bit over $4 right now. In Washington State, it's around $5 or a little bit over that. I mean, in neighboring states, Idaho and Oregon, I mean, we see these climate policies to a degree in Oregon, not so much in Idaho, but they're seeing high prices as well, but it's still around 60 cents lower than Washington. Is what's setting Washington State apart those climate policies, the Cap and Invest program, or is it other things?
It's really mainly the Cap and Invest program. Washington and California are really the only two states in the nation with such programs. California also has a low carbon fuel standard. So a lot of these climate programs disincentivize the use of fuels by driving up prices and using the tax revenue generated for other areas, including incentives for making the transition to EVs. So these types of regressive policies impact low income Americans that don't have the option of necessarily going out and buying a brand new electric vehicle. So a lot of that is the difference between Washington and Oregon is simply the Cap and Invest program in Washington State has now elevated prices permanently in Washington, and that has now pushed your prices up well above the $5 a gallon mark for gasoline. Washington State at 5.33, Oregon at 4.93, about a 40 cent a gallon difference, and the bulk majority of that is simply due to the fact that Washington has a Cap and Invest program that Oregon does not.
So, looking at the difference in prices, I know the Cap and Invest program is setting it up about 60 cents or so. Is the difference between, say, even without that, what Oregon, Idaho, California would be at? Is the difference between that and prices other places in the country that are closer to $4? Is that due to the refinery closures in California and elsewhere on the West Coast?
Yeah, when you start comparing Washington to other regions, there can be two different things that are impacting, compared to Idaho, for example. Idaho generally is sourced by refineries down in Salt Lake City and other areas of the Rockies, so they're a little bit more insulated. The West Coast, the closer you get to the coastline, virtually the more you're competing in the higher prices right now, given the Strait of Hormuz shutdown. Places like Seattle, where that oil, diesel, and gasoline that's being produced at Cherry Point could easily be exported. So prices in Western Seattle are higher because you're more exposed to the global marketplace. Places like Oregon, right on the coast, where gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel can be exported, again, more susceptible to this type of situation where the Strait of Hormuz is blocked. So you look at Idaho, a little bit more inland, a little bit more insulated, a bit more difficult for the oil that's produced at these refineries in the Salt Lake City area in the Rockies. It's a lot harder for that refined product to be exported to other markets. So, states like Montana, Idaho, Colorado, Wyoming tend to be a bit cheaper than those coastal areas. And this is certainly a very unique setup that it's not just impacting the Gulf Coast, but I mean, you talk about the Gulf Coast as well. Down in Texas, Texas price is still relatively low because there's so much refining capacity. But of the biggest increases compared to prior to the war, you're seeing all the coastal areas are seeing very similar increases, whereas the inland areas, if you see the map behind me, a lot of the nation's lowest gas prices are very, very deep inland in communities where that gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel cannot be as easily exported.
And we're already into the fifth week of this conflict in Iran. Uh, Consumers are hoping that it's not going to be as permanent as these cap and invest programs in Washington and California. What are you looking for that'll tell you that prices are fixing to head down?
I think a lot of it is going to be dictated by whatever happens between the US and Iran, particularly on the Strait of Hormuz. Whether or not a ceasefire impacts the Strait of Hormuz, I mean, in theory, war could still rage in Iran between the US and Iran. If the Strait of Hormuz, though, is untouched, if it's still essentially in its closed status, we're really not going to see any improvement to gas prices, even if there is a ceasefire. So, whatever develops from here on forward, if anything has an impact on resuming transit through the Strait of Hormuz, that is going to be what's most impactful. And if we don't see anything that covers the Strait of Hormuz specifically, well, then oil, prices and refined product prices will continue to go ahead until the strait is sorted out.
And leading into this administration, Trump was really pushing the drill baby drill policies, as well as making sure that our U.S. oil reserves are full. I mean, what difference does that have on gas prices now? If he wasn't pushing these policies and U.S. oil reserves weren't in the condition that they are now, how might would prices be higher than they are now? Would they be lower?
Yeah, I mean, the US SPR had been going up virtually every week until between 2023 and about a month ago. The SPR refills have now ended that President Biden had signed. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve sits at about 419 million barrels, and now Trump has agreed to start releasing about 172 million barrels. So, again, we're seeing another president utilizing the SPR. Those barrels are starting to come onto the market. In fact, JIT data out this morning showed the SPR declined by about 1.3 million barrels or 1.5 million barrels in the last week, meaning that the releases from the SPR are starting to hit the market. They're not really going to be very impactful, though, in reducing price because while we sit and talk, 20 million barrels of oil every day are being blocked through the Strait of Hormuz. And the U.S. is releasing a rate of only about a million and a half barrels per week. So, excuse me, per day. And that is just going to start ramping up. Over the last week, we've only seen about a million and a half released. On a weekly basis, the Department of Energy is hoping to increase that to about a million barrels a day, but that still pales in comparison to the 20 million barrels being blocked through the Strait of Hormuz. So the U.S., again, the president relying on the SPR, starting the releases. That'll continue for roughly 6 months. That's not really having an impact on price. I think the other part of your question, the other things that the administration is doing, there's only small levers that the president really has. He's waived the Jones Act. He's issued waivers to allow E15 use year round. He's waived in partial capacity the requirement to switch to summer gasoline. All of these things are not going to be very impactful when you compare it to the potential reopening of the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm. If the conflicts ease soon, say they strike a deal today, later this week, how fast might we see gas prices ease? Would it be days, weeks, months? And why do we often see these prices fall slower than they rise?
Well, I mean, it's not necessarily a slower fall. It just takes a period of several months to fully pass along the decreases. They would start decreasing rather soon. I mean, if oil plummeted today, if the Strait of Hormuz reopened, if there's confirmation on both sides, oil would probably plummet today, and gas prices would start to go down by later this week. It only takes a couple of days for that to start. But oil wouldn't just plummet all at once either. Oil prices would progressively and slowly decline over the next few months as the situation improves, as oil starts flowing. And it, for that reason, would also take gas prices several months to follow the price of oil. It's not going to be an immediate plunge. Even if the strait reopens, we're talking about 5 weeks of missed oil deliveries, and that can't quickly dramatically shift overnight. So as goes oil, I mean, it would be probably a knee-jerk reaction, a one-day plunge in price, but then it would only be followed by smaller decreases. And gasoline prices do track with oil. I just don't think oil is immediately not going to drop down to its pre-war level because global inventories are now so tight that it's going to take several months for oil prices to more slowly decline. There may be, like I said, an initial gut reaction of oil dropping maybe 10 or 15%, but beyond that, any decreases are going to take much longer for them to fully play out. Gas prices will continue to follow whatever direction oil prices move.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us about this today. Before we
Sure.
close up, what do you have to say to consumers at the pump who just aren't sure how much longer that they can stomach this increase?
Yeah, I mean, it may be wise to start doing things like reducing consumption, trying to even drive more fuel efficiently, combining your trips. It's hard to know when the end of this would be. I mean, really, it's been unpredictable. There's been a lot of back and forth. So, try to reduce consumption, try to buy and fill your tank up at lower prices. There's a lot of volatility in what stations are charging. Apps like Gas Buddy will show you lower prices. But beyond that, buckle up. It could be a bit of a bumpy ride here over the next weeks as we try to see what direction the country may head next when it comes to the US and Iran.